Hello and welcome back to another video with myself, Airtic Hydra. Today we're going to be going through a little more lore and canon for Necromunda. Specifically, we are going to be delving into the structure, the function and the anatomy of a hive city itself. Having previously discussed the various levels and sector of a hive city, it is now to delve further into the actual anatomical features and the very organs that allow this city to thrive. I know the elephant in the room is obviously going to be the clans and the gangs and the houses, which really give Necromunda the exciting fluff that is its punk gang setting. However, I would like first to paint you a perfect stage in which to set our descriptions of the gangs so that you can picture a world in which they exist and one where they have sufficient motivation to try and kill each other. But just before we delve into the actual content of today, a quick thank you for anyone who commented or threw a like or even just watched the last video. Much appreciated. I will try and take on board some of those thoughts and we shall work on our vocabulary. But you certainly have kept me inspired to continue this series and I will endeavour to do so. If there are other topics you would like to see, let me know down in the comments below. And now, for the topic itself, the Hive City. And so we shall start today by looking at the Spire in some more detail. The Spire itself, if you remember, is where you will typically find the merchant houses, the noble houses, the consortium of galactic merchants and financiers, whose leaders control the immense wealth of the planet. Of course, you will find the actual ruling house, or sometimes known as the Imperial House, on the very penthouse. Of Hive Primus, this is where you will find Lord Gerotinus Helnoir, Adeptus of the Imperium of Man, Guardian of Necromunda, in the holy name of the Undying Emperor. He rules not just Hive Primus, but technically all of Necromunda, and it is him who is tasked with providing levies toward the Imperium, and it is his head on the chopping block should those levies not be met. But the Spire itself does more than simply house the bourgeoisie of the Hive cities. It serves many mechanical and functional purposes. Climbing at least 4 miles high into the atmosphere, one can see that the Spire itself will start to peek out of the very toxic fog that covers this entire planet. And so this is the first opportunity a Hive City has to literally get a breath of what is almost, at least the closest they'll get, to fresh air. And this is where you will find a great number of still working and functional purification plants, which are tasked simply, as the name would imply, with purifying air which is drawn in from the surrounding atmosphere and then moving it down the city into the hive, of course supplying the Spire itself on the way. These very same purification plants can be found throughout the entirety of the hive shell, but that being said, those further down within the level of the actual hive city, and certainly those level with the Underhive, would be, let's say, overridden and easily succumb to the level of pollution simply exceeding their purificational capacity. Therefore, it is up to the Spire, almost forming a reverse role of the roots from a plant, to deliver nutrients, light, fresh air even, down to the hive below. The light itself is brought into the city and Spire by a series of gullies and slits which admit light directly inside but also allow light to be accumulated and brought down to the lower hive via a series of giant cables, otherwise known as optical fibre or plexiglass. By the time the light reaches the lower hive, the illumination is similar to that of a dimly lit cathedral. But in the Spire itself, there is even, at least on the outer sections, actual daylight to enjoy. Such luxuries those of the lower hive would only ever dream of experiencing, even just once. And so, having discussed the air and light within a hive city, or rather the lack of, at least as far as the lower levels are concerned, we turn our attention towards the shell. The very structure that protects the hive city from the outer elements, and certainly every hive city of every hive world would find itself in need of a protective shell. And this is not just from planetary bombardment, orbital strikes, no. This is from something far, far more dangerous. You see, if you have a planet full of industry, producing particulates for millennia upon millennia, you get left with an environment that is somewhat more frictious. And certainly the ashen storms that are produced from such an atmosphere would bring a hive city to its knees if it were not for this protective layer. But it is not just a protective shell. There must be entrances and exits if one were to allow in air, and certainly there are. There are gateway fortresses as well, leading to networks of tunnels between spires and between, in cases, some cities as well. Convoy compounds, garrison blocks, gateway blocks. The hive city itself functions much like the skin of a human being, allowing certain particulates inside for a degree of trade or exchange, protection from outside intruders, and above all, shielding it from hostile elements. And now, before we move on to the residential areas of Necromunda, we shall briefly return to that geothermal heatsink we had mentioned in the last video. The geothermal heatsink, typically ranging from 1 to several kilometers wide, draws up heat from the planet's very core, with its long plasteel shaft puncturing the planet's inner layer. The heat from this is converted into raw energy by various plants and generators that are dotted along the surface of the plasteel cylinder. And within the hive city, these very generators would be the source of an immense amount of friction between gangs, although they are not present within the lower hive levels and certainly not within the underhive itself. These generators provide an opportunity for a gang to extort huge sums of money from others. However, things are a little more complicated than that, as the various transmission lines may travel through another gang's territory, in which case money will often exchange hands, deals will be struck, power will be transferred from one area to another, and resources will be exchanged. But certainly, this starts to give rise to the feudal nature of the Necromundan hive, and how one gang might find themselves eyeballing the property or resources of another, wondering what luxuries they would be able to afford, or even necessities for that matter, if they were to claim it as their own. And it would be perhaps prudent here to mention that not every imperial citizen within a hive city is going to be a member of a gang. In fact, gang members would certainly be the exception rather than the rule, those that choose to live outside of what would be traditional imperial law, but hive cities find themselves being so big and cumbersome, any means to try and enforce such a legal system is all but futile. And this gives ample opportunity to those who wish to better themselves, but also place themselves at a degree of risk. The average imperial citizen, however, within a hive city would be travelling from their harbour block to their manufactorums with the sole aim of surviving another day and procuring enough rations to merely carry on. And carry on they have. For Necromunda has a reputation not only of producing particularly fierce Imperial Guard regiments, but it is also a particularly industrious hive world, recycling a great wealth of its previous machinery into tools and equipment for the Astra Militarum. Necromunda's manufactorums are brimming with industry. Although there is likely a degree of mining to still be done, the majority of the resources from this world would have long since been exhausted. The populations are put to use within ginormous manufactorums, factories which by any modern standard would appear to be giant industrial singular machines, like being inside that of a colossal titan, equally impressive, perhaps even more imposing. Billions upon billions would be making their way every day to these very manufactorums, producing and contributing toward the Imperium, as well as the industrious waste that pollutes the very planets they try to breathe in. And it would be this very same industrial waste that would often lead to the demise of the manufactories themselves. For the ashen waste outside of a hive city is not static, it rises with each passing Terran year. And certainly it is only a matter of time, therefore, before the ashen waste would rise above the level of a manufactory's given waste outlet, at which point the pumps would typically fail and the manufactory itself would be rendered useless. At which point the hive levels would often abandon, sending their population up to the level above, hoping that there is still sufficient work for them. The manufactories often left, scavenged for all they are worth, occasionally even filled in to provide a more stable base for the city above. But many of these that are left derelict find themselves infested with scabies, mutants often shunned by the hive city dwellers, perhaps even frequented by unsavoury criminals looking to escape the eyes of another gang or perhaps some of the local arbitrators. Ruined manufactories often serve as little more than a scavenging ground or a hideout for scrap metal or anything that may be of some small value to a trader. And as dark and dingy as this would seem, it is still preferable to living outside of the city, where the next ashen storm would quite simply tear you to pieces. And if not for that, the acid rain would certainly prove to be another obstacle, and yet there are still those who defy the elements and attempt to make an existence outside of the reach of the Imperium and outside of the hive cities themselves along its very periphery. But let us now delve into the Underhive itself, that infamous area known for its warfare and struggle. The Underhive is not just a proving ground, an area where gangs from the hive city would seek to carve out territory and settle disputes. It is as old as the city itself, meaning that 15,000 years of technology once existed here. Although much of it will have been excavated many years ago, occasionally seismic activity, or something of the sorts, will reveal long-collapsed domes, access tunnels, or new blocks that may have previously been believed to have been buried beneath rubble. And with such events, certainly there will be a race in order to procure any lost technologies, items or artifacts of various value, perhaps even simply scrap metal from these areas which can be traded up above within the hive city. And one must consider that there is not just opportunity for excavation within the Underhive and an opportunity to settle disputes. In amongst the almost open warfare, there are indeed certain horrors that have crawled up from down below, for the Underhive itself is not the very lowest level of the hive city. The Underhive often simply abandoned layers from previous manufactorums and harp zones. The original city perhaps even lays beneath. This would often be referred to as the sump or sometimes the Hive Bottom. And here I feel we should probably end with a quote. At the base of the hive, buildings become so structurally dangerous that the region takes on a different and even more inhospitable character. This is the final and deepest zone called the Hive Bottom. Hive Bottom is so decayed and crumbling that the original domes and foundation piles have long since collapsed, forming a layer of almost solid rubble. Within the rubble are enclosed pockets linked by holes and tunnels worn by liquids leaking from above. These pollutants and effluents, the discharged fluid from the entire hive city, form a vast lake of radioactive putridity called the sump. And nothing can live in the Hive Bottom other than the most monstrous of mutants. Its denizens are the spawn of darkness and pollution. Some of these foul creatures find their way into the Underhive. Or even into the lower parts of the hive city, but their natural domain is the darkness of the Hive Bottom.